Nurse Nightingale. That's what Dr. Ashford called her over the intercom, his voice dripping with synthetic concern, ensuring every staff member heard the mocking nickname echo through Sacred Heart's ICU. They didn't know that the woman folding linens with hospital corners sharp enough to pass inspection had once kept 7 wounded soldiers alive through 40 minutes of enemy fire. They didn't know that the barely perceptible limp in her left leg came from shrapnel, classified and surgically removed, a permanent reminder of decisions made in Tikrit 3 years ago. He had no idea what he was standing next to. Dead wrong about the quiet nurse in Portland. Hannah Clarke's hands moved with the precision of someone for whom muscle memory was the difference between life and death. The night shift at Sacred Heart began at 2,100 hours, and she arrived 30 minutes early, a habit from her former life that she couldn't quite break, clocking in at 20:30, moving through the ICU like she'd mapped every tile, every cabinet, every patient room 1,000 times before. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, and the air carried that particular hospital smell, disinfectant layered over something copper and organic, the scent of bodies in crisis. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame built for endurance rather than presence, and when she reached for supplies on the high shelves above the medication station, her left shoulder hitched, barely visible, the kind of movement only another trained operative would catch. Most people didn't notice. Most people looked at Hannah Clarke and saw exactly what she wanted them to see, a competent but unremarkable nurse, 15 months into her position at Sacred Heart, no visible background, no complications. In her locker on the 3rd level, wrapped in a plastic evidence bag she'd been meaning to throw away since week 1, sat a faded unit patch. Coast Guard insignia. The edges were frayed from being sewn into the jacket lining of a man who'd been pinned under burning debris in a Tikrit alley, a man she'd kept breathing while rounds tore through the walls around them. She wouldn't throw it away. Some part of her knew she might need to remember what she'd been, on nights when the weight of being erased threatened to crack her composure. She never opened the bag. The act of carrying it was enough. The new admission to room 407 arrived at 21:45, and Hannah was pulling up his chart before the orderlies finished settling him into bed. General Mitchell, Coast Guard, 72 years old, presenting with atrial fibrillation and a 2-day history of chest discomfort. The chart noted his combat service, decorated, extensive, and Hannah felt something in her sternum tighten as she read the name. 3 years. It had been exactly 3 years since Tikrit, since the court-martial that destroyed everything she'd built in uniform, since General Mitchell had signed the decision that forced her into civilian life with a medical discharge labeled failure to maintain combat readiness and a security classification that prevented her from explaining what really happened. She'd rebuilt herself from nothing. She'd become a nurse because it let her keep her hands moving, keep them saving lives, keep them from shaking. She'd become a ghost in Portland with a limp that hurt every morning and a patch she couldn't throw away. She checked his vitals with her voice carefully neutral, measuring his blood pressure at 158/94, heart rate elevated at 92 and irregular, oxygen saturation at 96% on room air, all documented, all professional, her fingers gentle as she placed the pulse oximeter on his finger. The general didn't seem to recognize her, and why would he? 3 years ago, she'd been Major Hannah Clarke, part of a classified unit, her call sign Widow 6, her reputation built on an extraction under fire that she could never publicly claim. Now she was just another night shift nurse in a hospital full of night shift nurses, and that was exactly how she needed it. Dr. Ashford entered room 407 at 22:03, and his presence changed the air pressure in the room the way a predator changes the dynamics of a herd. He was tall, impeccably groomed, with the kind of jawline that conventionally announced competence, and he carried himself with the certainty of someone for whom consequences had never arrived. He was flanked by a resident Hannah didn't recognize, and he reviewed the general's chart with theatrical precision, nodding at the EKG strips, occasionally making notes with a pen that probably cost more than Hannah's rent. His eyes tracked across Hannah as she documented her findings at the bedside computer, and something in his gaze settled on her like a hand pressing down on her shoulder. When he spoke, his voice carried the sort of practiced warmth that made your skin feel cold. "Nurse Nightingale," he said, the nickname somehow making it sound like she'd been caught in a mistake she couldn't quite remember making. "Could you step into the hallway for a moment?" She followed him out. The hallway was empty except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of a patient's call button being answered 3 rooms down. Ashford's voice, when he spoke, had shifted registers, no longer the performative warmth, now something colder, more calculating. "I've been reviewing your patient notes from the cardiac ward rotation 2 weeks ago. There seem to be some discrepancies in your charting times. Medications documented as delivered at times when you weren't actually present on that unit." He let that sit in the air between them. "Concerning. I'd hate to see you develop a pattern." Hannah said nothing. She kept her eyes level, her breathing steady. The trembling that wanted to start in her hands, she pushed it down, locked it away in the same compartment where she kept the unit patch and the memories of Tikrit. She'd survived worse than a doctor's insinuation. She'd survived a lot worse. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll review my documentation practices." Ashford smiled. The smile looked like a wolf showing its teeth. "I'm sure you will." The dispensary was quiet at 0330 hours, the pharmacy tech on break, the stock levels needing updating before the morning shift arrived. Hannah moved through the aisles with the economical grace of someone who'd learned to move through dangerous spaces without drawing attention, checking inventory, restocking the 14-gauge angiocath needles and the saline flushes, the routine of it almost meditative. She reached for the controlled substance cabinet, the secure locked drawer where the morphine and fentanyl and other opioids that kept suffering at bay were inventoried, counted, accounted for. The cabinet was slightly ajar. She froze. The key to this cabinet was held by exactly 3 people, the pharmacy director, the night shift supervisor, and Dr. Ashford, who'd requested after-hours access during his recent rotation as the ICU's attending physician. Hannah's eyes adjusted to the low light, and she could see the computer terminal at the dispensary's far corner, its screen still glowing softly. She moved closer, careful not to touch anything, and saw what she needed to see: medication logs open, controlled substance tallies being modified, numbers being shifted in real time in a way that made her stomach turn cold. The trail was obvious if you knew what you were looking at, which she did, because she'd been trained to identify irregularities, to catch discrepancies in the field, to spot when someone was running a supply diversion. Dr. Ashford stepped out from behind the tall shelving unit where he'd been waiting, and for a moment neither of them spoke. His voice, when he came, carried no warmth at all. "Working late, Nurse Clarke." She took one measured breath. Then another. She'd learned in Tikrit that panic was a luxury, that the ability to stand still while being hunted was the only thing between you and becoming a body that someone else had to carry. She looked at him, registered the certainty in his face, the absolute knowledge that she'd seen what he was doing and the absolute knowledge that he had leverage now, that this was exactly what he'd been building toward since she'd walked in on him and his secrets. "Yes," she said quietly. "Just restocking supplies." "Good." His smile returned, sharp as broken glass. "I'd hate for any of this to go up the chain of command. These things have a way of destroying careers. Nursing licenses especially. Hard to practice medicine when the board of nursing has questions about your integrity." He closed the screen on the computer as she watched, not bothering to rush, not bothering to hide that he understood exactly what she'd seen and exactly what she was going to do about it, which was nothing. Because he was right. One accusation, one investigation into her background, and everything unraveled. The medical discharge, the classified operation she couldn't discuss, the reputation she'd spent 3 years quietly rebuilding in anonymity. He had her completely. Hannah nodded once, took the restocking cart, and moved past him toward the exit. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. The trembling she felt wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the carefully controlled fury of someone who'd been trained to function under conditions that would destroy ordinary people. She was getting very good at containing it. What she didn't know, as she walked back to the ICU at 0345 with Drive Ashford's voice still echoing in her ears, was that inside room for 07, General Mitchell was reviewing his admission paperwork with shaking hands, staring at a name on the nursing roster that had been burning in his memory for 3 years. What she didn't know was that the man who'd signed the decision that destroyed her career had spent the last 2 months buried in declassified Pentagon documents, discovering that the orders he'd signed had been modified after his signature was affixed, that Major Hannah Clarke hadn't abandoned her post, she'd been following extraction protocols that were changed after he authorized them. What she didn't know was that everything was about to come apart, that in exactly 2 days, a gas main would explode in Sacred Heart's West Wing, and the moment she threw herself over General Mitchell's body to shield him from falling shrapnel, the years of hiding would become irrelevant. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was running out of time to understand why General Mitchell had come to Sacred Heart in the first place, and it wasn't for his cardiac condition. The overhead page crackled through Sacred Heart at 2 p.m., Dr. Ashford's voice smooth and professional as a news anchor, Nurse Nightingale to administration. Nurse Nightingale to administration. Hannah froze mid-IV insertion in the cardiac ward, the needle steady in her hand though every muscle tightened. Around her, staff exchanged glances, that mocking nickname he'd weaponized, broadcast across every floor, every department, ensuring maximum witness to whatever humiliation waited in that office. She finished the insertion without hurrying, capped the line, and pulled off her gloves with deliberate care. One tear escaped down her cheek as she turned away from her patient, wiping it away before anyone could read it as weakness rather than rage. The walk to administration felt like walking through water. The hallway tiles clicked beneath her shoes, a sound like bullets counting down. She'd survived worse than this. She knew she had. Her body remembered Tikrit, remembered the weight of a .308 round, remembered the taste of concrete dust and her own blood. She'd survived extraction through a kill zone. She would survive this. Dr. Ashford sat behind his desk like a man who owned the building, flanked by 2 department heads whose discomfort was written across their faces like neon signs. His eyes were the color of wet asphalt, cold and reflective of nothing real. "Nurse Clarke," he said, not inviting her to sit. "We've had concerns about your performance metrics. Your attention to protocol has been inconsistent." Hannah stood at attention, hands clasped in front of her, the posture automatic from a lifetime ago. Her voice came out steady, almost conversational. "My patient outcomes speak for themselves, doctor." He dismissed her with a wave, the gesture designed to sting. The meeting lasted 47 seconds. She timed it by the wall clock behind him, watching the second hand jump like a pulse. 3 days passed. 3 days of being invisible in the hallways, of feeling Dr. Ashford's attention like a sniper's scope tracking her movements. 3 days of wondering if this was strategy or just the warm-up to something worse. It was worse. She was in the supply closet during the evening shift, counting Gore's inventory, 32 stacks of 4, 128 packages total, the repetition soothing in its mindlessness, when the door closed behind her with a soft click. Dr. Ashford stood between her and the exit, positioning himself like a wall. The space narrowed. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its endless mechanical drone, and suddenly the shelves of gauze felt like they were closing in, compressing the air until breathing required conscious effort. His voice dropped to a whisper, the kind of whisper that only carries a few feet but lands like a blade. "I've been reviewing your credential file, Ms. Clarke. There are gaps. Unexplained years. What are you hiding?" She could smell his cologne, expensive, aggressive, the kind that announced itself before the man wearing it did. He stepped closer, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, all compressed power and implied threat. "One more mistake and I'll have your license suspended for incompetence. Do you understand?" Hannah's hand gripped the metal shelf, her knuckles white against the stainless steel. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh, him, this man who altered medication records, threatening her license. But she took one measured breath instead, drew the air deep into her diaphragm the way she'd learned in rooms where breathing wrong meant dying. Her eyes met his, and she held them like a lock, like a challenge. "I understand that good people recognize threats, doctor." Something flickered behind his eyes. Anger, maybe. Uncertainty. He stepped aside, not because she'd intimidated him, but because she'd refused to break, and refusal was a language he didn't speak. She walked past him without apology, her shoulder brushing his intentionally, a boundary being marked. That evening, the parking lot at the end of shift. Hannah emerged with her team, 6 nurses who'd become something like friends, who'd covered her shifts and brought her coffee and asked her how she was doing with the kind of genuine concern reserved for people who mattered. The July heat radiated off the asphalt in waves, the air thick and still. Dr. Ashford stood by the staff entrance holding a maintenance cart. A mop. A bucket. His stance was theatrical, ceremonial, a man preparing to conduct an execution. Nurse Clarke. A moment. The group stopped. Even before he spoke, everyone knew what was coming. Bad news doesn't wait for privacy. He approached with the confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences, holding out the mop like a scepter, like he was offering her the crown jewels of humiliation. 2 residents nearby stopped talking. Everyone watched. "Due to your performance concerns," he said, his voice carrying across the lot, ensuring maximum audience, "I'm reassigning you from ICU to custodial rotation, effective immediately. Perhaps simpler tasks are more your speed." Laughter from the residents. A sharp, barking sound that hung in the hot air like an accusation. Hannah took the mop. The wooden handle was smooth and weathered, worn by 1,000 hands she'd never know. She looked at Dr. Ashford for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to catalogue every detail, long enough to let him see that she was still standing, still present, still whole. A single tear tracked down her cheek, and she wiped it away deliberately, meeting his eyes before speaking. "I've survived worse than you, Doctor." Then she turned and walked to her car. The mop handle was cold in her hand, a weight that felt almost like a weapon. Her former team remained frozen in the parking lot, their faces arranged in various shades of shock and something that looked like respect. Nobody moved until she'd pulled out of the lot and turned toward home. 2 days later, the assignment came through. West Wing retrieval. Condemned section, structural repairs, pull patient files before closure. The message appeared on her work phone at 11 p.m., Dr. Ashford's name attached with that thin smile she could almost see through the screen. She arrived for the night shift at 10:58 p.m. and made her way to the West Wing, where half the lights had been disconnected, where caution tape marked the hallways like crime scenes, where the smell of natural gas hung faint but present. Maintenance had been working on the main lines all week, tightening connections, testing pressures, leaving the building breathing like a patient on life support. The files were in a records room on the 3rd floor, accessible only through the condemned corridor. Hannah carried a flashlight, her scrubs crisp and clean, her wound from the supply closet fully healed now, reduced to nothing but memory and muscle. She pulled files methodically. Mitchell, General Coast Guard. His file was thicker than the others, layers of medical history, psychiatric evaluations, discharge papers marked confidential. She was reviewing the last page when she saw him. General Mitchell sat in a wheelchair near the observation lounge window, seemingly confused, his oxygen tubing tangled around his shoulder. The hallway was supposed to be empty. Maintenance was supposed to be finished 3 hours ago. But there he was, just past the yellow caution tape, directly below the section where cracks had started forming in the concrete ceiling. Hannah stepped toward him, her voice steady. "General, you shouldn't be down here. This section's closed." That's when the building spoke. It was a sound like the earth breaking open, a primal groan of stressed metal and concrete at war with gravity and time. The floor shuddered. The fluorescent lights swung on their chains, casting shadows that jerked across the walls like seizures. Hannah felt it in her bones before she understood it in her mind, a catastrophic failure, the natural gas main rupturing, pressure building to explosive levels. The West Wing buckled. The ceiling began to collapse, rebar tearing free from concrete moorings, the sound of the world ending compressed into 3 seconds of screaming metal. Glass from the observation lounge window shattered inward, transformed into shrapnel, into weapons, into something that wanted to kill anything human it could find. The general was directly in the trajectory, his wheelchair locked, his body frozen by shock or medication or the simple human inability to comprehend that the building above your head was no longer a building but a weapon. Hannah's body moved before her brain caught up. Muscle memory from Tikrit, from a dozen firefights where thinking meant dying, where instinct was the only currency that mattered. She ran 4 steps and threw herself over the general's body, her arms wrapping around his head and torso, dragging him and the wheelchair backward as the beam collapsed where he'd been sitting milliseconds before. The pain came like lightning. Jagged metal, maybe rebar, maybe something worse, buried itself in her shoulder blade with a wet, tearing sound that she heard before she felt it, and then she felt it everywhere, a bright white fire that radiated down her spine and across her ribs. Blood spread hot and fast across her scrubs, soaking through to her skin, pooling beneath her knees. But the general was gasping, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. Hannah forced herself to look. Sucking chest wound. A penetrating trauma through his 4th rib space, his lung collapsing, tension pneumothorax building, minutes counting down before cardiac arrest. Her training overrode the fire in her back. She couldn't treat herself. She could treat him. Her hands moved with the terrifying precision of someone who'd held lives together before, who understood that pain was information, that shock could be managed through focus. She reached for his personal effects bag, found an MRE wrapper, meals ready to eat, military issue, the kind that came with General Mitchell's transport papers. Her fingers worked without trembling, despite the blood, despite the metal still lodged in her back. She tore the wrapper open with her teeth, cleared away the foil, and created an improvised chest seal, taping 3 sides with gauze from her pocket, leaving one side open so air could escape but not enter. A flutter valve. A temporary solution to a permanent problem. It would buy time. She keyed her radio with steady fingers, her voice measured and clinical, the voice of someone reporting weather rather than catastrophe. "This is Clarke, West Wing, multiple casualties, need immediate evac." The pause lasted 3 seconds. Long enough to understand. Dr. Ashford's voice crackled back, calm and unhurried, a man discussing weekend plans. "Ms. Clarke, the trauma team is at a conference. Stabilize and wait for secondary response." She realized with the cold clarity of someone who'd survived before and would survive again, he knew. He'd reassigned the trauma team. He'd sent her to the condemned wing. He'd done this deliberately, calculated the collapse like equations written in bone and blood, believing she'd be alone, believing there would be no witnesses, believing that a medical disaster in a condemned section would require an investigation that might never happen. But the general was still breathing. The West Wing was already dying when Hannah Clarke walked into it on the afternoon of the 2nd day. Concrete dust hung in the air like a fog that hadn't learned how to settle. The fluorescent panels above had stopped working 3 weeks ago, leaving only the thin grey light from the narrow corridor windows, the same windows that faced the mechanical room where the gas main sat coiled and waiting. Hannah carried the patient files for General Mitchell, the ones that needed to be transferred to the main hospital system before the wing was sealed off permanently. It was a clerical task. A nothing task. The kind of work Ashford assigned when he wanted someone out of sight. She'd known this would happen. After the parking lot, after the mop and the public humiliation, she'd understood the mathematics of his cruelty. He was building a case against her now, layering each reassignment like evidence. And the West Wing was perfect, condemned sections of hospitals belonged to nobody. They were administrative limbo. If something went wrong there, if someone got hurt, the investigation would take months. By then, her badge would already be gone. The files were in medical records, a metal cage of a room at the end of the 3rd-floor corridor. Hannah moved through the silence, her footsteps echoing off the tile in a way that made the emptiness feel intentional. The stairwell smelled like rust and old copper. The elevator had an out-of-service sign taped to its doors. Everything about this wing whispered abandonment. What she didn't know was that Dr. Ashford had rerouted the trauma team to a pharmaceutical conference in Seattle. 43 people, surgeons, residents, emergency physicians, every attending who might have been within 3 minutes of the West Wing, were sitting in a hotel conference room 2 hours away, listening to a presentation on cardiovascular outcomes. He'd made the calls himself, cited budgetary constraints, insisted on the importance of professional development. The kind of lies that didn't need to be questioned because they came from a doctor with a direct line to the hospital's chief medical officer. That same CMO was his former roommate from medical school. That same CMO owed Ashford a favor from a malpractice suit that had been quietly settled 5 years ago. Hannah didn't know that either. She knew only that the hallway was empty and the files were waiting, and something about the pressure in her ears suggested the afternoon was about to change. The gas main explosion didn't announce itself. It simply became the world. The sound came first, not a bang but a deep, resonant crump that felt more like the earth's breath than fire. The corridor in front of her buckled. Not all at once, but in a terrible sequence. The floor tilted, the ceiling panels dropped, and then the windows, 6 feet of reinforced glass that faced the mechanical room, didn't shatter so much as obliterate. The rebar that had been embedded in the concrete frame came through like spears. Metal shards the size of dinner plates followed, spinning through the air with a weight that made the sound of their passage audible, a terrible whistle that meant something was moving fast enough to cut. Hannah was knocked backward into the stairwell door. The impact drove the breath from her lungs. Emergency lighting flicked on, the backup generators struggling to life, and in that stuttering red glow, she saw him. General Mitchell was in his wheelchair at the far end of the corridor, exactly where he'd been moved that morning for a transfer to Sacred Heart's East Wing. Exactly where someone had strategically placed him, alone, in a room that was about to collapse. The general wasn't moving. His hands were gripping the armrests, and his eyes were locked forward, frozen in that peculiar paralysis that comes when the body recognizes it's about to die but hasn't quite accepted it yet. The rebar came first. A twisted piece, maybe 4 inches in diameter, that would have gone through the middle of his chest if he'd been standing. As it was, it passed 3 feet to his left, punching through the wheelchair's frame and embedding itself in the wall with a sound like a struck bell. Glass followed in a cascade that sounded like the hospital's collective collapse condensed into a single moment. The fluorescent lights exploded. Sparks dropped from severed wires. The ceiling beam above him groaned as it tilted. Hannah's hands moved. Not a decision. Not a thought. Muscle memory from 18 years ago in Tikrit, from a dozen other moments when the distinction between living and dying was just being faster than the falling metal. She pushed off from the stairwell door and ran, her legs eating the distance, her eyes on the dropping beam and the general's frozen face. The shrapnel came then, jagged fragments of metal that hadn't been part of anything, that had only existed in the moment of explosion. One tore through the air where her shoulder had been a half-second before. Another caught the edge of the files she was carrying, spinning them across the corridor floor. She reached the general's wheelchair moving at a full sprint and pivoted, using her body weight to push the chair backward, away from the impact zone, just as the ceiling beam fell. It crashed down exactly where they'd been standing, sending another spray of dust and concrete chips across the floor. The general made a sound, a small, truncated gasp. His hands were still gripping the armrests. Hannah kept moving, pushing the wheelchair down the corridor toward the stairwell, her shoulders burning, her left arm screaming with a pain that didn't match the movement. She didn't look back. The emergency lighting painted everything in shades of red and shadow. The hallway had become a maze of debris. She had to maneuver the chair over fallen concrete, around metal shards, past the still-burning electrical fire that had started where the ceiling beam had hit. The chair's wheels caught on something, a piece of rebar, maybe, or a section of the acoustic tiles, and she had to wrench it free with a movement that sent fresh lightning through her shoulder. They made it to the stairwell. The doors were still intact, though the frame was bent. Hannah shouldered through them, pulling the wheelchair after her, and found a cleared section of hallway on the other side, a section that smelled like concrete dust and ozone and something else, something metallic that might have been blood or might have been the air after electricity had tried to kill something. The emergency lighting here was steadier. The walls were intact. The ceiling hadn't fallen. She stopped the wheelchair and immediately began her assessment, hands moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The general was conscious. His pupils were reactive. But his breathing was wrong, short, shallow, pained. His lips were already beginning to grey at the edges. Shock. The kind of shock that came from a pneumothorax, from air in the pleural space, from a lung that couldn't expand because something inside his chest had collapsed it. The emergency light above them flickered. Stabilized. Flickered again. Hannah's radio crackled to life. Dr. Ashford's voice came through clear and precise, with the kind of artificial calm that only came when someone was reading from a script. All personnel are to evacuate the West Wing immediately. No exceptions. This is not a drill. She keyed her radio, her fingers already moving, already assessing. We've got a patient in distress. West Wing, 3rd floor. Requires immediate intervention. The pause that came back lasted exactly 2 seconds. All personnel are to evacuate immediately. Medical teams will be positioned at the East Corridor checkpoint. Transfer is to occur under standard protocol only. Hannah understood what that meant. It meant stabilize and move. It meant don't do anything that required a physician's signature. It meant that if the general died in that stairwell, the autopsy would show that he'd been given every chance, that protocol had been followed, that nothing had been missed because nothing had been attempted. The general's hand found her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were sharp. Conscious. Aware. And when his lips moved, when he forced out the words through the pain and the shortening breath, his voice was the voice of a man who recognized something he'd thought was impossible. "Widow 6, he whispered. Hannah froze. The corridor exploded in slow motion. Hannah didn't think. Her body moved on instinct, the kind of instinct that comes from 1,000 hours of combat medicine, from holding pressure on wounds while rounds pinged overhead, from knowing exactly what happens when a 70-year-old man stops breathing. She threw herself over General Mitchell's wheelchair as the shrapnel screamed through the air, a jagged metal fragment the size of a man's fist burying itself deep into her shoulder blade with a sound like a hammer striking wet meat. Pain was information. Pain meant she was still conscious. Pain meant she could work. The general gasped beneath her, his punctured lung pulling in air that had nowhere to go, and Hannah's hands moved on their own. 3 years of muscle memory, of field medicine under fire, of keeping people alive in places where the only option was alive or dead. She reached for his pocket, her fingers trembling not from fear but from adrenaline flooding her system like rocket fuel, and found the MRE wrapper, the emergency ration pack from his personal effects. Her hands tore the metallic plastic into a square, and she pressed it against his chest wound, creating the seal, watching his chest rise and fall as the lung re-expanded. 13 seconds. That's how long it took. The blood spread hot across her scrubs, mixing with her own blood, impossible to tell where he ended and she began. "Widow 6, the general whispered, his eyes finding hers. Hannah froze. But there was no time to freeze. The corridor was collapsing. Dust hung in the air like a chemical fog, and somewhere beyond the debris field, she could hear boots, the evacuation team, the response vehicles, the machinery of disaster management grinding to life. She grabbed the wheelchair's push bar with her right arm, the one that still worked, and began to move. Dragging. Her left arm was nearly useless now, the shrapnel grinding against bone with every movement, a sensation that bypassed pain and became something else entirely, a sensation of wrongness, of pieces that no longer fit together. The concrete crunch beneath the wheelchair's tires. Once. Twice. The hallway stretched like taffy, like time had gone viscous and slow, but her vision remained clear, her breathing steady, her mind compartmentalizing the damage the way only a trained soldier could. The evacuation team appeared through the dust like phantoms. 3 paramedics in yellow vests, pushing a gurney, and behind them, Dr. Ashford. His face was a mask of professional concern, the kind of expression he'd spent 20 years perfecting. He looked at Hannah, blood-soaked, swaying on her feet, the shrapnel still protruding from her back like some grotesque sculpture. He looked at General Mitchell, pale and barely conscious but breathing, the chest seal holding. And then his eyes moved back to Hannah, and something behind his pupils shifted. Not horror. Not concern. Recognition of opportunity. "Get her out of here," Ashford said to the paramedics, gesturing at Hannah with the casual dismissal of someone flicking lint from a jacket. "And someone document this entire scene. I want a full incident report on my desk within the hour." Hannah's hand remained on the general's chest, maintaining pressure, her eyes fixed on the rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. She didn't acknowledge Ashford. She didn't move. A paramedic finally stepped forward, young, with the nervous energy of someone still new to trauma, and gently pulled her away from the wheelchair. Hannah's vision tunneled as she stepped back, the adrenaline draining out in a rush that left her shaking, her knees buckling, the floor rising up to meet her. Someone caught her elbow. The world tilted. And then the paramedics were loading the general onto a gurney, their hands efficient and practiced, and someone was wrapping a blanket around Hannah's shoulders while another voice was saying something about the ER and blood loss and shock protocols. The medical bay was a blur of fluorescent light and clinical efficiency. They laid her on an exam table, cut away her scrubs with trauma shears that clicked like angry insects, and a resident, older than the paramedics but not by much, appeared above her with a scalpel and tweezers. The shrapnel removal took 40 minutes. Hannah watched the ceiling tiles, counted the individual fluorescent tubes, and felt the resident's hands probing the wound with a clinical detachment that bordered on contempt. 3 inches of jagged metal. The resident held it up to the light, whistled low, a sound like a tea kettle, barely audible, and dropped it into a specimen tray where it clinked against stainless steel. Missed the lung by centimeters. The words floated past Hannah's consciousness like debris in a current. She'd been hit before. This was nothing. This was survivable. The stitches came next, the resident's hands moving with efficient, impersonal precision. No one met her eyes. The sutures pulled the wound closed with a sensation like someone tugging on piano wire, and Hannah remained motionless, her breathing shallow, her expression locked in the neutral territory between pain and acceptance. That's when the door opened. Dr. Ashford entered the exam room holding a clipboard, his white coat pristine, his expression composed. Behind him came 2 hospital administrators, their ID badges catching the overhead light. Ashford moved to the foot of the exam table with the kind of careful deliberation usually reserved for delivering terminal diagnoses. "Ms. Clarke," he said, his voice a model of administrative sympathy, "pending investigation into protocol violations during the West Wing incident, you are suspended without pay. Your access badge and hospital credentials, effective immediately. Please surrender them to security before you leave." Hannah sat on the exam table, her back bandaged with careful, geometric precision, her scrubs cut away and replaced with a hospital gown that gaped open at the back. She took one measured breath, in through her nose, out through her mouth, the kind of breath taught in combat medicine training. When she spoke, her voice was steady, flat, drained of all inflection. "I saved his life." Ashford's smile was thin, translucent, the smile of a man who'd already calculated the mathematics of blame. "You exceeded your scope of practice. You violated direct orders to remain in your assigned area. You contaminated a quarantine zone during an active emergency response. Badge. Now." She said nothing. She reached into her locker, the one in the physician's lounge, not the nurse's station, because Ashford had restricted her from the staff areas, and retrieved her spare scrubs, her personal items, the small accumulation of 3 years' worth of night shifts. Her ID badge sat on top, the photo showing her face from 8 months ago, when she still looked like someone who believed in protocol and hierarchy and the fundamental fairness of institutional medicine. The hospital laundry was empty at midnight, the machine silent, the air heavy with the smell of industrial detergent and bleach. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in an electric hum. Hannah stood at the folding table, the surface worn smooth from 3 decades of use, and looked at the pile of scrubs before her. Blood-stained. Torn. Bearing the chemical signature of a life saved and a career ended, the 2 indelible marks of a single afternoon. She began to fold them. The fabric was stiff, still damp in places, and she worked with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, hospital corners so sharp they could pass inspection, the color-coded system of the laundry service observed with perfect accuracy. Each fold was mechanical, deliberate, the kind of work that required no thought and therefore allowed all thought. She saw herself 3 years ago in Tikrit, sewing a unit patch into a jacket lining while rounds struck the walls around her, the needle moving with the same steady rhythm. She saw herself 8 months ago, arriving at Sacred Heart for the first time, believing that a new city and a civilian identity could erase the classification, the code names, the weight of operations that couldn't be discussed. She saw herself 23 minutes ago, creating an improvised chest seal from an MRE wrapper while her own shoulder blade shattered, and she understood with absolute clarity that some things don't erase. They transfer. They persist. They emerge. She folded the last scrub and set the stack on the supervisor's desk with the precision of a soldier folding a flag. Her access badge went on top, the weight of it negligible, the meaning of it immense. She stood there for a moment, her left arm still immobilized, her back screaming with the kind of pain that exists below language, and then she turned toward the delivery entrance where the night air was cool and the rain had begun to fall in that soft Portland way that made everything look washed and new. She walked out through the darkness where no one could see her shoulders drop, where no one could witness the moment when the carefully maintained equilibrium finally shifted, where no one would ever know that she stood in the rain for 40 minutes with her face tilted upward, letting the water mix with tears that came not from pain but from the terrible recognition that erasure, once begun, is almost impossible to reverse. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that in room 407, a man was waking up from surgery asking for a name he'd spent 3 years believing belonged to someone who'd betrayed him. The worst part was knowing that the truth, when it came, would change everything in ways that Hannah Clarke, suspended nurse and secret major, couldn't yet imagine. In the darkness, her phone would ring before morning. And when it did, everything would fracture open again. The general's eyes opened in recovery at 3:02 a.m., and Hannah was there delivering his post-op chart when his trembling hand reached for her wrist. His fingers were still weak from surgery, but his grip was urgent. He whispered a single word that made her entire body freeze, Widow 6. That was the name. Not Hannah. Not Ms. Clarke. The classified military call sign she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years, the designation she'd carried through Tikrit, through the court-martial, through 8 months of serving coffee and enduring humiliation from a man who thought she was nothing. The general's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, the walls came down. He knew. He had always known. The ICU went silent. Monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm. A ventilator wheezed its steady cycle in the adjacent bay. Hannah set down the chart with steady hands, the same hands that had held together a bleeding man in a condemned corridor, the same hands that had created a makeshift seal from an MRE wrapper while shrapnel still sang through the air. Before she could speak, the doors to the recovery bay opened and Commander Mitchell stepped inside, her dress uniform catching the fluorescent light like polished armor. Behind her came a woman Hannah didn't recognize, older, carrying a file folder marked with the red stamp of the Department of Defense. The commander's voice was clear, formal, ringing with the precision of someone delivering long-delayed truth. Major Clarke, my father wants to speak with you. Major Clarke. Not nurse. Not Ms. The word hung in the air like a defibrillator's electrical charge, sudden, transformative, impossible to ignore. Hannah's breath caught, but her face remained composed, the mask of civilian restraint still firmly in place even as something ancient and buried began to crack beneath the surface. The general pulled himself upright, his movements careful but deliberate, hands shaking as he reached inside his hospital gown and withdrew something worn and faded. It was the unit patch. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment patch, Night Stalkers, and Hannah recognized the stitching immediately. Her stitching. The tiny, precise sutures she'd sewn into his jacket lining during the Tikrit extraction 3 years ago in a firefight that had ended with her medical discharge and his court-martial testimony. She had sewn it there to mark him as extracted, as protected, as belonging to her unit even after everything had fractured. He had kept it. All these years, he had kept it stitched inside his jacket, against his chest, over his heart. I didn't know, the general said, and his voice broke like ice on a winter river. His knees hit the floor beside her wheelchair, and the room's collective gasp echoed off the tile walls, a sound like wind escaping through sealed doors. The classified orders were changed after I signed them. You weren't abandoning your post. You were following extraction protocols I never saw. Commander Mitchell stepped forward, her hands trembling as she opened the declassified file. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 years of delayed justice. Major Hannah Clarke. Silver Star. Purple Heart. Recipient of the Coast Guard's highest commendation for valor in Tikrit. She carried 7 wounded through a kill zone for 40 minutes. The file was thick, pages of redacted operations, medical records, after-action reports, all now unsealed. All now real. All now proof that what happened in that street in Fallujah had never been her failure. It had been her finest hour. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Ashford. That same evening, as Hannah sat alone in the hospital chapel trying to reassemble herself, State Medical Board investigator Chen was sitting across from Ashford in a cold conference room on the 3rd floor. Hannah wasn't there to witness it, but she would learn every detail within hours. Chen had opened her briefcase with the deliberate precision of someone who had been doing this for 23 years. "Dr. Ashford," she'd said, her voice flat and professional, "you initiated an investigation into Nurse Clarke's credentials 3 weeks ago." "Correct." Ashford had nodded, confident, his attorney beside him. "Due to concerns about her competence, yes." That was when Chen slid the first document across the polished table. "Your investigation triggered a routine audit of all personnel involved. During that audit, we discovered significant irregularities in medication dispensary records dating back 8 months. Specifically, narcotic discrepancies." Ashford's face had drained of color. Chen continued, relentless, "We have security footage from the dispensary showing you altering electronic records on 14 separate occasions. We have pharmacy inventory logs showing systematic diversion of controlled substances. We have testimony from 3 nurses who reported concerns that were dismissed by administration." She'd slid another document. "And we have Ms. Clarke's written statement from 8 months ago, filed with HR and ignored, documenting that she witnessed you altering medication records." Ashford's attorney had leaned in, whispering urgently, but Chen was already standing. "Dr. Marcus Ashford, your medical license is suspended pending criminal investigation for narcotic diversion, falsification of medical records, and patient endangerment. Federal prosecutors will be in contact." 2 security guards escorted Ashford from Sacred Heart Hospital at 2:14 p.m., his hands shaking as he carried a single cardboard box of personal effects, a framed medical school diploma, 3 pens, a coffee mug that said "World's Best Dad" that nobody had ever seen him use. Hospital staff lined the hallway in silence. Not the silence of respect. The silence of erasure. The hallway he'd owned for 8 months, where he'd called out mocking pages and handed out humiliation-like badges of honor, became his execution route. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. Within a week, the State Medical Board revoked his license permanently. Federal charges followed: 8 counts of narcotic theft, 14 counts of falsifying medical records, 6 counts of patient endangerment. His attorney negotiated aggressively: 5 years probation, permanent loss of medical credentials, $250,000 in fines, mandatory community service. By month 2, Ashford was sitting at a folding table in a strip mall parking lot off Powell Boulevard, a hand-painted banner reading "Supplemental Insurance, Ask Me How," in front of him. Nobody asked. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause nobody wanted to give. Sacred Heart settled with Hannah within 30 days. Wrongful termination. Full back pay. Restoration of her nursing credentials with formal commendation. A public apology from the hospital board read aloud at a staff meeting that Ashford never attended. But Hannah didn't return to nursing. 3 weeks after Ashford's license was revoked, Commander Mitchell visited her apartment with a different kind of file, one marked Coast Guard Personnel Command, Official Review Board. "Your medical discharge has been overturned," the commander had said simply. "Your rank is restored, retroactive to date of separation. Your service record is corrected. And your command is offering you a training position at the Coast Guard Academy. Combat medicine instruction for the next generation." Hannah had held those papers with hands that betrayed nothing on the outside and everything on the inside. 6 months later, Sacred Heart Hospital's main atrium filled with people who finally understood who they'd been working alongside. Hannah stood in her Coast Guard dress uniform, the newly restored Major's oak leaves polished and bright on her shoulders, the scar on her back hidden beneath pressed blue fabric. The uniform fit better now, she'd gained back the weight she'd lost during the harassment, the hollow look replaced with something harder and more certain. General Mitchell approached in his full dress uniform, flanked by Commander Mitchell and a Coast Guard honor guard in dress whites, their uniforms sharp as surgical instruments. The hospital staff filled the atrium, nurses, doctors, administrators. Even patients who'd heard fragments of the story. The general opened a velvet case and removed the Distinguished Service Medal, the ribbon a cascade of red and white and blue, the medal itself catching light like a captured star. "Major Hannah Clarke," he said, his voice steady now, formal, carrying the weight of 3 years of delayed recognition, for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire, for selfless service above and beyond the call of duty, and for saving my life twice, once in Tikrit, once in this building. It is my profound honor to present you with this recognition. He pinned the medal to her chest. The metal was warm from his hands. He stepped back and saluted. The entire honor guard saluted. Hannah returned it, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her eyes dry. Through the atrium windows, visible in the parking lot of the strip mall across the street, Dr. Marcus Ashford sat at his folding table, clipboard resting in front of him, a single pen, and hours of empty sidewalk stretching in both directions. 2 people had stopped all morning. One took a flyer and threw it away 10 feet later. Hannah saw him through the glass, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. She felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, just the faint echo of something like pity for a man who had confused cruelty with strength and learned too late that strength doesn't kneel before weakness. At the reception afterward, a young nursing student approached Hannah nervously, her hand shaking slightly as she held her punch cup. "Major Clarke, I just finished my first clinical rotation. I want to be like you, but I don't know if I'm strong enough." Hannah set down her glass and looked at the young woman with the same devastating calm she'd once used to face down her tormentor. Strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about knowing what matters when everything else is stripped away. She glanced back toward the window, toward the empty folding table and the man who'd tried to erase her. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. General Mitchell joined them, his hand resting briefly on Hannah's shoulder, the same shoulder that had taken shrapnel meant for him. "Major, your class at the academy starts in 2 weeks. Are you ready?" Hannah straightened, the weight of the medal on her chest a permanent reminder that some things can be restored, that some wounds heal stronger than the original bone. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." She walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital through the main doors in uniform, not through the delivery entrance in shame, but past the staff who'd once served alongside her, and who were now standing in a line, applauding. If you're still here at the end of this story, you know what it means to stand back up. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who carry their strength quietly until the world finally sees it. Leave a comment. Have you ever been underestimated? Like this video and join us next time.